Here's our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight. I'm Tian Wei in Beijing. We begin today's program in Europe. U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo will travel to the U.K. and Denmark from July the 20th to the 22nd to discuss issues including economic recovery, trade, and ties with China. The Trump administration has been urging all countries to shun Chinese tech giant Huawei. Earlier, the U.K. announced a ban on Huawei's involvement in their 5G networks. Meanwhile, European countries are facing many challenges within their borders. EU leaders are negotiating an $850 billion pandemic recovery plan in Brussels. They have failed to reach a deal so far after lengthy discussions dragged into Monday, despite being scheduled to end on Saturday. The pandemic has caused over 135,000 deaths in the EU, while its economy is estimated to be shrinking by 8.3% this year. For U.S. EU ties in Washington, D.C., we are joined by Gary Martin, Senior Professorial Lecturer at the School of International Service from American University. Meanwhile, in Chapel Hill, we are joined by Klaus Laris, Distinguished Professor of History and International Affairs from University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Gentlemen, welcome to both of you. First of all, the EU summit regarding the budget is still undecided. What are we likely to see in terms of consensus about the future of the EU?
Indeed, the EU summit turns out to be a very long summit. We have already had 3 days of summitry, and there could well be another day or two. In the end, I'm pretty optimistic that there will be a compromise, but it will be a hard-fought compromise. Essentially, there are 4 countries, so-called the frugal 4, who are resistant to give too many grants to the southern European countries, Spain, Italy, and Portugal, who really need the money in particular because of the coronavirus, and they have been hit very badly by that. But I'm optimistic that a compromise will be found, because the alternative would be disunity, even the collapse of the EU.
I see.
No one
How about looking from the other side of the Atlantic? 1.8 trillion US dollars, that's supposed to be the EU budget. Meanwhile, there are a lot of positions, according to Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany, among all the countries. So, Professor Martin, your take?
I think what we're seeing with the pandemic, or the effect of the pandemic, is it's exacerbating existing tensions in the EU that were there before. There's been a long-standing tension between North and South when it came to European economic recovery from the financial crisis in 2010. And so the demands of the frugal states mentioned by Professor Laris, they've long believed that the southern states have not always been careful, and they're very wary of giving money for free to these European states. And to be fair, the other key dimension is that they have public opinion behind them supporting that line. Mm-hmm. So you have to keep in mind, you have 27 member states who also have to contend with public opinion here.
Having said that, though, we see that Europe as a whole, with the EU at its core, trying to struggle for some future strategies, if they could. Professor Laris, what is some of the signs you have been reading regarding the future strategy of the EU?
Yeah, the strategy, the first strategy clearly is to overcome the coronavirus crisis. The second strategy clearly is to rejuvenate the European economy, to make it into a flourishing economy again. The third strategy would be to turn the EU into a more global power than it has been in the recent past. But these are all very steep tasks, and it will be very difficult to achieve them. And I think in 10 years' time, that will be the same with the EU. In 10 years' time, no one will remember whether we spend 400 or 500 billion euro on the current effort. But what will be remembered is whether or not the EU will stick together and will not collapse, but will go on being a united, powerful bloc in world history. I think that is what is really.
Yeah, very interesting, Professor Larry, to talk about that, because now we see the U.S. Secretary of State, Mr. Pompeo, is likely to visit both the UK and Denmark. Tell me more about whether Washington could also, as an ally, play divide and conquer in a way, in leading, quote unquote, what the European unions are likely to do in the near future?
The discussion in Brussels doesn't seem to be happening to Washington, which is very sad, of course. That would not have been the case 10 or 20 years ago. And that is really a feature of the Trump administration, which has a lack of interest in European unity. And secondly, it may even be interested in dividing up the European countries among each other. And Pompeo going to the UK and to Denmark is, of course, interesting in terms of foreign policy and China policy, due with the discussion being played out in Brussels. That seems to be on a very different planet what Pompeo is doing. He's more interested in containing the fallout regarding that geopolitical battle between China and the United States, which is going on, rather than being too concerned about the fate of the European continent. And as a European, as a German, as you say, I'm of course very much concerned that the European Union may split up and may not be united again in the future. And I think that would be a loss for all of us, including the United States and China and everyone else in world politics, I believe.
I see, Professor Martin, I remember Professor Laurie said the one phrase that seems to be about another planet, comparing Mr. Pompeo's agenda to that is going on among the EU countries right now. Your take?
I think one of the important dynamics here is the heavy-handed nature of the Pompeo approach, and Pence back in February basically saying you have to make a choice on Huawei. It's either you're with us or with them. That backfired. So I think the U.S. is trying to pick a slightly more subtle approach. I'm not sure it's necessarily going to be any more successful, but it's still interesting that there's been a little bit of an evolution. I mean, we had a National Security Advisor, Mr. O'Brien, being in Europe and trying to work with some of the key allies in Europe. But I would agree that in many other areas, the Trump administration has either been indifferent or hostile to the EU. So that has certainly made relations very challenging, to say the least.
Very interesting you mentioned that. We do see, in fact, a series of high-level visits by Professor Martin, the U.S. administration to Europe. Overall, do you see a strategy coming from the Trump administration regarding Europe or the European Union?
I don't know if I would agree with the words strategy. Might be pushing too far. I think
see.
What you've had, feature of the Trump administration, is a very transactional approach. So on areas where the Trump administration, Washington, believes that Europe might be of service, such as on the question of China, I think you have seen an attempt at courting. But on other areas where there's been difference of agreements, we've seen over tariffs, for instance, we've seen over the Iran nuclear deal, there's been no problem, no hesitation to take measures that were very unpopular. So I think it's much more of a transactional and a case-by-case approach. But I do think, and I think it's fair to say, that the Europeans have taken in the last few years, I would say, a harder line towards China. Not as hard as the Washington line, but nonetheless, there's been some minimal convergence. But convergence at a time when there's so many disagreements on other areas. So I think that's important. As for the question of the next administration, I think it will make a significant difference depending on the outcome.
What are some of the goals of the EU? Whether that has been clear, particularly since the election and the new leader of the EU and the European Union coming into power, and particularly with some of the elections going on in some major European capitals this year or to come. Professor Laurie, how much do you think these pictures are clear?
EU does have or wants to have an independent path in foreign policy, including towards China. I fully agree that the EU has also become much tougher towards China than they were, let's say, only 5 or 10 years ago. At the same time, the Europeans do not just want to follow the Americans in their China policy. They also want to have a unique, independent role and path towards China. And they need to do that, of course, because they, as you know, they are in their trade policy very much exposed to the Chinese market. So they have to take that into consideration. And traditionally, the Europeans have had good relations, constructive relations with China, including and above all Chancellor Merkel in Germany. So they believe they have the possibility to be a bit of a mediator, to be a power in the middle, which can really overcome that increasing, escalating conflict between the two superpowers.
Right.
And I think it's a very, very tough ambition and a very tough objective, but perhaps it's not totally impossible for them to achieve it to some extent.
Would the EU be able to make a decision about its future relations, for example, vis-a-vis China, the United States, at this point? Or is smarter for the EU and for individual capitals as well to make that decision after the new administration comes into power?
I think I would mention a couple of factors here. I think one is, of course, let's not forget also that the leadership question is also, I think, asked on the European front, because Angela Merkel has been the face of European leadership now for 15 years. But we do know that at least come a little bit more than a year from now, she will no longer be chancellor. So there will also be a void on the European front. One of her key goals has been to try and seek European unity on so many subjects. So I think there will also be an internal European dimension to try and figure out the answer to these key questions about the role of the EU on the world stage and how to navigate this great power competition, great power rivalry, whatever we want to call it. And I also think these are going to be long-term challenges and long-term decisions. I don't think it's going to be one policy decision. I think it's something that's going to be developed over the course of the next 5-10 years.
Yeah.
So I think there's necessarily urgency, but I would add as a final point, which is important here, pay attention, keep an eye on the reaction amongst the European public. If anything, the last 6 months has really made the European public deeply skeptical, not only about American leadership, but about Chinese leadership as well. And so that's, I think, is a wake-up call for European politicians as well about this need for emancipation on the world stage.
But I think there are, of course, some issues which are bilateral largely between the EU and China. So not everything involves the United States, and whether there is another Trump administration or another Biden administration, for example, the investment treaty between China and the EU is relatively independent of that.
That's
Here,
right.
China and the EU have been negotiating for the last 7 years, since 2013. They still haven't reached an agreement. Now it is hoped that the agreement will come next year in 2021, and we don't know whether or not that is the case. You know, there are many hurdles on the way. Both sides want an agreement which would enable the EU to trade with China in a much better way, in an easier way, in a less burdensome way. And so both sides are actually highly interested in that, as it would push bilateral trade. And these projects will go on independent of what will happen in Washington. And there are other projects as well of a slightly lower level between just the EU and China, and also between China and individual European countries. So not everything is dependent on the White House and the United States. They are important, but there are other things in the world as well.
A few questions regarding Huawei and the science and technological development going on between China and the EU, and also regarding EU's relations with the United States. Now, we have seen, Mr. Martin, the UK has made this decision. What does the UK decision mean for the other capitals inside Europe? So what do you think would be a smart attitude and approach the European capitals individually could have, and also collectively through Brussels?
There's definitely been a toughening up and greater amount of pressure by the United States on the question of Huawei. Is that going to have a knock-on effect on other European capitals? I'm not so sure, at least immediately. I think a lot of it will depend on what Germany chooses to do. But I would add, I think, in my estimation, I think the most important or the most useful step that EU member states could do is to try to come up with a collective answer or collective standard towards China and towards many other issues. I think it weakens the EU, it weakens Europe if other states can basically adopt a divide and rule. And I think it also provides greater consistency if you have a common approach to these major challenges.
It's also important, as to how the EU collectively and each individual capitals would make their decisions regarding their relations with the United States. We see that relation has been evolving already. Now, with as clear an issue as Huawei, it's almost like a crystallization about which decision you want to make, at least for now. How do you think would be the smartest way that the European capitals would approach this question and approach its future relations with the United States?
Yeah, I mean, they cannot be seen as giving in to browbeating from the Trump administration. When you think of the pipeline between Germany and Russia, Nord Stream, which is very critically viewed in Washington, Germans and the Russians simply are insisting on going ahead with that. And I think something like that we will also see regarding Huawei. The British, as I said on a different occasion, the British have essentially given in to the United States. But after Brexit, after leaving the EU, the British do not have anywhere else to go. If they also not just lose the EU, but also lose the United States, then they are somewhere in the middle of nothing, which they cannot afford to do. And for the European countries, particularly strong European countries like France and Germany, this is not the case. So I can see that they will not totally give in the Huawei question to the United States, but they will be looking for a good compromise. And perhaps I can see a compromise coming, which was on the first compromise the British entered into, that Huawei, that the percentage Huawei is allowed to have in 5G networks in Europe will be capped to 30%, 35%, as it was in the British case, and that they will not be allowed to deal with the core issues, but the parts will have to be in the periphery of these networks. They have that dilemma to be really squeezed between the two strongest powers on Earth, and both of these powers they need in order to survive in a trade way, to export, and also politically. They need to be on good terms with both of these superpowers, and that is a dilemma which they will find the next few years busy to look into and to resolve somehow. But an ideal solution, I think, will not exist.
I think separate is the effect of the pandemic on the necessity or the pressure to control your supply chains, I think is also a factor that will probably weigh on European decisions to protect critical infrastructure. So I think that's also something that may be weighing on the minds of many European leaders as well. Yeah.
Very interesting question, both of you gentlemen, because as you can see that recently the Chinese Huawei has already asked the U.S. side to pay for the IPR, the intellectual property rights that's involved in the 5G technologies, which the American companies have been using free of charge over the years. So there are a lot of things, much more than just geopolitics, that's going on in terms of the interest tug of war between Huawei and the United States. And many really wonder, where are the European capitals and where are the European companies regarding all of those complicated issues? But for now, I want to really thank both of you for joining us on this fascinating discussion. Future is not clear, but certainly with insights from yours, we could better figure out what is likely as to be. Thank you so much, Professor Garrett Martin and also Professor Klaus Laris. All the best.
Thank you.
Thank you. Be safe.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure.
My discussion with two professors on transatlantic relations. You're watching World Insight. Coming up on our program, what role does cultural difference make on people's dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic? Answers from my interview with a well-known scholar on Neo-Confucianism right after this break.
The world is changing fast, taking all our lives with it. But we can change it too, by seeking answers to problems through discussions and debates. On World Insight, I ask direct questions to real people in the know, seek genuine answers, but respect diverse perspectives. Our live global debates tackle the most critical issues head-on. World Insight with Tian Wei go beyond the headlines.
Welcome back. This is World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. The fight against the pandemic has continued across the world. There are now over 14.5 million confirmed COVID-19 cases globally, with over 606,000 deaths. Beijing has downgraded the risk level in all districts to low recently. Last month, it was hit by a sudden spike, but authorities were able to contain it. But in some other parts of the world, the coronavirus infections continue to surge, unlike the situation in Northeast Asia. In the United States, for example, total cases have now topped 3.7 million, nearly 500,000 new cases in the week, with more than 140,000 deaths. And the debate continues over whether people should still be required to wear masks. Why was mask wearing slow to catch on in the West, many wonder? And are the advantages of a Confucian culture more apparent during a crisis? We try to figure out some of the cultural differences behind the realities of the pandemic by talking to Daniel Bell, the Dean of the School of Political Science and Public Administration at Shandong University. Let's listen in. Now I'm joined by Daniel Bell, Dean of the School of Political Science and Public Administration from Shandong University. Daniel is a well-known scholar worldwide on Neo-Confucianism. Let me ask you about your take on the latest crisis regarding COVID-19, the global pandemic. What do you make of the cultural elements of how we are dealing with it?
I think one of the features of China and Chinese culture is that there's a respect for hierarchy that is grounded in superior ability and virtue. So sometimes it means respect for conscientious professionals. We can call them modern day junzi or exemplary persons. Sometimes it could be social critics, or sometimes it could be for example, Dr. Zhong Nanshan, who was famous for helping to deal with the SARS crisis in 2003. And once he sounded the alarm on this new SARS-like virus on January 20th, it's not just the government, but the people respected him and basically agreed with measures, very strong measures taken 3 days later to deal with the crisis. And there's also respect for, we can say, a very capable government led by officials selected in a meritocratic process who will take measures in the interest of the well-being of the people. I think because of those two conditions, China effectively, well, so far anyway, dealt with this urgent crisis of COVID-19.
That is really a myth so far. Some suggest the Northeast Asian culture, more collectivism rather than individualism, and also more respect for professionals. At crisis, more unity. Is that a myth, or is it really part of the culture? Though it is hard to argue that in other cultures, at difficult times, people would not come together, right?
Well, it's part of culture, but it's not necessarily unique to China or to Confucianism or to East Asia. I mean, aspects might be shared elsewhere. For example, in the Nordic states, there's also respect for a very capable government that acts in the interest of the people. And there's also a commitment to social responsibility, which might be stronger in countries that have a more individualistic culture, like the United States.
Earlier, I talked to Thomas Friedman, a well-known columnist from the New York Times, and he argues that at this difficult time, that maybe the Chinese system could work when there is a public health crisis, though the so-called Western democracy system or market economy system could work well during the ordinary days when we talk about the economy or when we talk about the vibrancy of the society. Do you think, of course, that's his theory. I mean, as a cultural scholar, as a philosopher, how do you see the real difference, or it is still a myth?
So I think that it's true that when it comes to dealing with emergencies that require sacrifice by the people, generally speaking, cultures with a Confucian heritage, where there's a tradition of social responsibility, concern with social harmony, as well as combined with a kind of legalist heritage, Fajia in Chinese, which is basically a strong state that values efficiency. When those two are combined, it can effectively deal with emergencies, especially important and hard to do in a large, diverse country such as China. I mean, if it's a small little island state, like for example, New Zealand, it's much easier to deal with crises. But in large countries like China, I do think it requires some sort of long tradition of some Confucian style and legalist style culture. Now, whether in ordinary times those can hamper progress, I mean, that's partly true but again, it depends on how for example, the Confucian culture is interpreted. I mean, one of the central Confucian values is harmony, and if you hear that in English, it sounds like conformity or uniformity, or basically blindly listen to your superiors. But any Chinese intellectual knows the saying from the Analects of Confucius, meaning that exemplary persons value harmony, not conformity, not uniformity. So there's a respect, in fact, a celebration of diversity in this Confucian ideal of harmony. And that is fully consistent with pursuit of innovation and respect for example, minority cultures. But if the Confucian idea of harmony is distorted and meant to mean uniformity or blindly and conformity, then obviously that's incompatible with economic progress and innovation in modern societies.
In Northeast culture, not many, in fact, question about the function of a mask, and people are really willing and even go out of their way in order to find a mask. However, in another culture, let's just say in the United States today, it has become such a political debate and has been totally politicized. To many here in this part of the world, it's surprising because it's some would call it common sense. However, in the other culture, it's certainly not being taken like that. So, Professor Bell, you were growing up in North America, in Canada, though. But how do you see, the interesting comparison between "quote unquote" the West and the East?
Well, the mask-wearing common sense, it's partly rooted in history. For example, in Japan, it goes back a few decades. People would wear masks not just to protect themselves, but to protect others when they have colds. I was also in Hong Kong in 2003 when there was the SARS crisis, and people knew that you had to wear masks to avoid being affected by that virus. So when it came to this new virus, in much of East Asia, there was also a kind of ready memory, so to speak, and it became common sense that there was a need to wear masks, even when the science was not 100% clear. So now the science, there's almost indisputable evidence that wearing masks is important to prevent transmission. In the United States, the country is so polarized that if one political organization or party advocates one thing, almost automatically there'll be an opposite reaction from the other side. And also because of this strong tradition of individualism, maybe even to be a bit negative, celebration of hedonism at times.
So anyone harassing me to wear a mask, you guys are violating federal law.
Which makes this mask-wearing culture more difficult to become common sense, unfortunately.
We have all been talked to our friends, right, in either Europe or Canada, the United States, when wearing a mask was still a debate there. And some of them telling us, I don't want to wear a mask because nobody else is wearing a mask. You earlier, I recall, Professor Bell, you were talking about uniformity of culture. That's pretty typical in a Confucius society, but you see also it reflects in another way in the Western society. So how should we understand this? There seems to be a lot of entangled impressions and theories.
That's true. So I guess this kind of blind conformity is not just a problem in China or in East Asia, but sometimes in Western countries too, even though people wouldn't openly recognize it as such. There's a very large community of Chinese heritage in Toronto and Vancouver who had more knowledge of what's happening in China. So they knew that this COVID-19 could become quite dangerous in the early days, and they started wearing masks. And that affected the other citizens in Toronto and Vancouver. So it became the mask wearing common sense spread more quickly. But in Montreal, so to speak, there wasn't really a community that took the front lines, that became concerned with mask wearing that could influence the others to the same extent. And I think that's one reason, unfortunately, why Montreal was hard hit. There's actually more deaths in Montreal than in Wuhan, I'm sad to report.
Professor Bell is the author of several books, including The China Model, Political Meritocracy and the Limits of Democracy, China's Neo-Confucianism, Politics and Everyday Life in a Changing Society, and East meets West, Human Rights and Democracy in East Asia. Recently, he's been planning a new book that will explore what is Chineseness. Let's hear what he reckons are the key differences between the East and the West and their impact on our societies. So that is only one of those examples, Professor Bell. If you talk about the East and the West, there are other examples existing. For example, whether people are listening to the advice of when the city is being quarantined, whether they should party on the beaches while the virus is still unpredictable. We see some cultural differences. But talking about culture, Professor Bell, I know you're also now writing a book about Chineseness. It is not necessarily a racial issue, but rather a cultural issue. We've heard that debate also when if someone learned the Chinese history, that the Chinese have always been arguing this is not just a nation-state concept, but rather a cultural concept. We also have seen books in the West talking about China as a civilization rather than a nation-state concept. So tell me more about what do you see as Chineseness or un-Chineseness? If you have one, you must have the other, right, Professor?
Well, that's a huge and great question.
I know it's a big one.
I'm only at the beginning stages of writing a book that was probably going to be at least a 5-year plan, maybe even a 10-year plan. But the basic idea is throughout much of Chinese history until about the mid to late 19th century, the idea of what it meant to be Chinese was a kind of cultural idea. It depends on the language, it depends on the rituals. But in the mid to late 19th century, this is one of the worst influence of the West. There was, of course, it's more the white West, so to speak. We can even say the white distorted form of Christianity West. There was a belief that the world can be ranked according to races, and with the white race on top. And that belief was propagated by sometimes consciously so, sometimes less consciously so, by Western imperialists. And that led to a big shock in China, of course, when they were militarily defeated by Western countries. And some Chinese leading intellectuals and reformers thought they thought that the way to become powerful is to affirm our identity based on race, but changing the classification with our race on top. So this idea, I think, is unfortunately a terrible influence of Western racism. And I think there's a good reason to go back to the traditional idea of what it means to be Chinese, but of course updated for the modern world.
It's very interesting to talk about this aspect of impressions, at least, of cultures, because with issues such as Black Lives Matter, it really provides us with another updated opportunity to look at the issue of race and the issue not just about the African Americans, but also of all diversities in the world and the respect for all. Having said that, though, Professor, I want to proceed with that direction a little bit more. How do you see that China has been keeping that balance. I don't know how well, but has been keeping that balance between so-called exceptionalism and also uniqueness. So these are two different concepts. Tell me more about your observations.
Well,
another book, I know, another
idea,
5-year plan, right?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, the traditional view of what it means Chinese was meant to be a universal idea. I mean, when Confucians defended their values, they thought that those values, in principle, are universally applicable and can be learned by anybody in the rest of the world, and also that those values are thought to be superior to other values. Although the way to spread them is through today what we would call soft power. Generally, there was the idea that we could use military force to force people to become adherents of, for example, Confucian ethics is very just pretty crazy and didn't have much influence in history. But today, I think we recognize that some values, basic values, are universally shared, that are rooted in Confucianism and shared with other traditions. For example, we shouldn't kill innocent people, torture is bad, people have, to use modern language, a right to basic material well-being. But beyond that, I think there's a recognition that societies that don't have the tradition of Confucianism spread over hundreds of years, if not longer, through everyday life, as well as through educational systems and so on. For example, that value social harmony, or that value political meritocracy, or that value justifiable forms of social hierarchy. Then we should just allow for a difference here. And the best way for China to live up to this form of Confucianism is just to do well at home and lead by example rather than by trying to persuade or force or even try to persuade others.
Professor, my final question. We are at a time of change. Besides COVID-19, there are other huge things happening. Geopolitics is one. When we talk about geopolitics, people always talk about ideologies, even though I do not know necessarily what it meant. But how do you see, the kinds of ideologies that politicians or political scientists, including you possibly, always have in their speech vis-a-vis the cultural identity and philosophy that has been with us for much more than a nation state, much longer than a nation state, particularly modern nation state. How do you see these very different and yet possibly similar concepts?
Well, the big problem is when two representatives of cultures engage with each other, and one thinks that they hold superior views or clear, more direct access to the truth, and engage with the other as a kind of somewhat inferior person who should be, through various means, whether it's force or persuasion, learn to become like me. I mean, much of the interaction of the West has been like with China has been like that. I mean, Jonathan Spence, the historian at Yale, wrote a great book called "To Change China," where he went through the history of Western missionaries and intellectuals and businessmen who came to China eventually with the idea that China should be changed to become basically like me, and they all failed because China has its own civilization and cultural habits, among other reasons. But obviously now it's the way to engage with another culture is to, hold on to one's beliefs and try to defend them, but also be willing to learn from the other culture and change one's original standpoint in response to that engagement. It seems to me that's the only way forward now.
Okay. Daniel Bell, Dean of the School of Political Science and Public Administration from Shandong University. He's originally coming from Canada and certainly a well-known scholar on Neo-Confucianism. Thank you so much, Daniel, for helping us understand from a philosophy perspective what's really going on. Thank you. Really appreciate it. And that's all we have for today. If you'd like to see more, you can certainly search our program World Insight or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei. On behalf of the team, thanks for watching. Bye for now.